afternoon, one and all. My name is Karen Hussey. I am the Deputy Director of the Global Change Institute at the University of Queensland, and it's my very great pleasure to be the moderator for this evening's event. First and foremost, allow me to give you a very warm welcome to this State of Affairs event, an event co-hosted by the Grattan Institute and the University of Queensland's Energy Initiative. Allow me also to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land on which we gather and pay respects to their ancestors who came before them and to their elders past, present and future. They say an engaging event is one that is topical, a source of contention, highly political, ideally with an existential element to it, and lastly, there should be just a smidgen of ideology evident to spice things up a bit. So what a treat we're in for. In all seriousness though, tonight we're talking about what the future of the coal and gas industries look like for Australia in light of recent commitments to tackle climate change. As you know, nearly 12 months ago, the international community of states, including Australia, signed up to the Paris Agreement, which saw a commitment to hold the increase in global average temperature to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, but ideally to hold global average temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Immediate concerns arising from that agreement have centred on how we can effectively and fairly decarbonise our economies and ways of living to meet that commitment. So too, we're grappling with how quickly that transition must or should occur. And recent events in South Australia have raised important questions about the speed with which climate policy, and especially the shift to renewable energy, is occurring. Are mistakes being made that we haven't thought carefully about the right energy mix that we need moving forward? Do we know how much time industries and societies traditionally need in order to adapt well to profound structural change? Are we in danger of throwing the proverbial baby out with the bathwater in our haste to deal with climate change? I suspect all of these questions will arise tonight, and hopefully they'll be answered. But in thinking about them, it might be instructive to very deliberately appreciate the timescale from whence the issue of climate change has arisen. If you're a climate change scientist, in the grand scheme of things, we are not acting quickly at all, and history is instructive. The greenhouse effect was discovered by an Irish physician by the name of John Tyndall in no less than 1861. 100 years of science later, the first official report of concern was delivered to the US President's Advisory Committee. It said the following, and allow me 45 seconds. Through his worldwide industrial civilization, man is unwittingly conducting a vast geophysical experiment. Within a few generations, he is burning fossil fuels that slowly accumulated in the earth over the past 500 million years. This may be sufficient to produce measurable and perhaps marked changes in climate, and will almost certainly cause significant changes in the temperature and other properties of the stratosphere. This is 1965, ladies and gentlemen. The report details the possible effects of an increase in atmospheric CO2 with extraordinary clarity. Melting of the Antarctic ice cap, rise of sea level at 40 feet per century, warming of seawater, increased acidity of fresh waters, and an increase in photosynthesis. At the time, the report's findings were overshadowed by concerns about point source pollution in air and water. But with the benefit of 50 years hindsight, the timing and thrust of its message is quite remarkable. They also say that an informative event is one that draws on recognised expertise delivered well. With that in mind, tonight we have a terrific lineup of speakers, all ready, willing and more than capable of talking about the implications of the Paris Agreement for Australia's economy, its businesses and policymakers. Our speakers tonight are Sandra McCulloch, Head of Environmental, Social and Governance Research at Credit Suisse, Professor Peter Ashworth, the Chair of Sustainable Energy Futures at the University of Queensland, Mick Bouffier, the Chairman of the World Coal Association, and David Blowers, an Energy Fellow at the Grattan Institute with many years' experience in the energy sector. Now, allow me to talk to you about format. We have precisely 1 hour and 5 minutes now, and our format is fairly straightforward. To begin with, each of our speakers will share their views on the subject. No doubt they will share those views both eloquently and succinctly. Anybody who exceeds the 5-minute time frame shall be punished severely. We'll then move to a lively discussion amongst the panel for a number of minutes before opening up for audience questions, finishing at 7:15, just in time to get home for Lee Sales. I'm aware that we have a very informed audience tonight, so I look forward to fielding lively and interesting questions from all of you. And naturally, I must now mention social media. For those of you that tweet, raise your hands. Marvellous. I admire you all. Something called a Twitter handle should be up there. Use it proudly and with confidence. Now, without further ado, allow me to introduce our first speaker for this evening, Sandra McCulloch.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Can I also introduce Zoe Witten down the front here? Raise your hand, Zoe. Zoe is the other half of the team. We've just published a 90-page report, so I've got 5 minutes to give the essence of that. But hopefully I can do it, because it's quite a simple concept. Our clients at Credit Suisse are institutional investors, our fund managers, and superannuation funds, the people who are managing your money. And they've been coming to us saying, we've been asked to do carbon footprinting on our portfolios. We've been asked to exclude carbon and certain assets from our portfolios, and seeking help on this. So after a long iteration, we wanted to look at what did a 2-degree scenario look for Australia. So a consistent modelling for scenario right across the economy. So we chose to use the Deep Decarbonisation Pathways work by ClimateWorks, ANU and CSIRO. And we came to the conclusion that basically not all carbon is equally risky. Our clients were being asked to look at, say, Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, and that was all the information they had when they looked across their portfolios. But that wasn't really telling them where the risks were if they've got a portfolio of 100, 200, 300 stocks that they're managing on behalf of their clients. We came to the conclusion that the greatest risks were actually downstream. So for a company, if you had substitutes for your product and people could make choices to not buy your product, then you had huge revenue risk. So the concern was that if you're a company and you've got upstream emissions, so you're buying electricity, that's captured in your Scope 2 emissions, then you can make choices. You can usually choose to go and buy renewable energy, so long as you haven't signed a 20-year PPA that used to be pretty fashionable, a few years ago, in which case it's going to take a bit of time before you can work your way through that. So upstream, you had choices to, reduce the carbon emissions of products you were buying. In the company's own processes, often if you're particularly not a capital-intensive type industry, you can decarbonise your own processes. Equally, if you don't do that, some of the competitors will come in with lower cost, lower emission type products, and you're going to face more risks than if you can wind your way out of the carbon intensity of your own processes. So those are the Scope 1 emissions, and our clients were being presented with data that just looked at those emissions in your own processes and the emissions upstream. There is no way to capture, any sort of reliable information about your downstream emissions, and that's where we think the risks are. So if you're a company and you're selling a product that is substitutable, so people can make choices and move away from that, that's where we think the risk sits in investment portfolios for our super funds. And there is no reliable way for these super funds to get that sort of data or measure it. So we've taken a look sector by sector across the Australian economy and come up with 4 types of companies. Those we say are in existential risk. Basically, we believe that's the coal and oil and gas sector. So looking forward to conversations, 2 speakers on. So we believe that their entire revenues are at risk. There's a sector we call high investor engagement. So they're where you think the company might be able to adapt. So some of our resource companies can adapt. They are not single resource companies. They have more than coal in their portfolio. So we're asking investors to seek active engagement with those sorts of companies. so that they can be confident that those companies can adapt. And if they're not comfortable, then that's probably where they'll be exiting those out of their portfolio. The third ones are ones that are policy dependent, and I think David will have a lot to say on this. So their revenues rely almost entirely on policies set by government and the stability of those policies. So, for example, if you're in the renewables and biofuels area, you are policy dependent, and that's where the biggest risk sits in Australia, is that policy part. And the final ones, which our investors love to know about, those we call the resilient upside. So it doesn't matter what governments do, what policy comes around, they are going to have resilient upside. To sum this all up, I'll use the example of a company like CSR. If you were an investor, a fund manager, and you're being asked to look at your Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, then I can tell you CSR looks pretty dreadful. And there'd be a lot of pressure on you to reduce the Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions in your investment portfolio, and you would think about exiting an investment like CSR. But if you look at it from downstream, CSR makes products that are going to probably flourish in a 2-degree scenario. Aluminium, glass, and they're adaptable. They will come up with more and more products that are going to suit a 2-degree scenario. So they're not the sort of company you would want to be automatically excluding from your portfolio. So that's kind of the summary of what we're looking at.
Fantastic, and on time. Well done. Peter, she has set the bar.
Okay, I'm really nervous because I love to talk. Okay. Look, thank you, Karen. Thank you for having me here. I know I'm not supposed to touch that, sorry. And it was interesting to hear the perspective on industry. I've skimmed the report. I haven't read it in depth, so I'm looking forward to engaging it. But as a social scientist on the panel, I'm going to focus on the human element. And I thought the best way to do that is actually to start with you, the audience. Okay. So, if we think about the last week or fortnight, it's been an interesting couple of weeks. And I'm not actually talking about South Australia, as you in the energy field would probably think about, but I'm talking about last weekend. Put your hand up if you watched the AFL historic grand final. Okay. Put your hand up if you watched both. Some people are admitting. What about if you just watched the rugby on the Sunday? Okay, we're starting to get a feel for this audience. What about if you didn't watch it at all and did something far more interesting because you couldn't give a rat's about that? Okay, panellists, do we get a feel? Okay, I've got some other questions here. You actually referred to energy expertise. Put your hand up if you would, and I'm not going to ask you a question to prove this, that you would classify yourself as an energy expert. Yeah, so not everybody in the room, but some. Okay, as an energy expert, do you study your electricity bill every time? Do you know how much petrol you put in? I think there's some really interesting things to think about behaviours and who we are. And I guess the other thing that I was going to think about also is solar, because often this discussion comes up between the renewables versus solar and so forth. Who has solar panels on their roof? Some, not all. Who actually didn't take the RECs to offset and kept it because they were being really good carbon sols? Not many. A lot of people probably don't understand the renewable energy certificates in that way. And also subscription to green power. Who subscribes to green power? A little bit? 100%? Okay. Probably about 3% of Australians subscribe to 100% green power. So the reason I did that, I guess, is to think about, who is there and what's driving our values, beliefs and behaviours. And I'm sure if I asked those same questions in Melbourne, Sydney, Perth, we'd have similar numbers, maybe different geographic nuances, talking about AFL and rugby. But then if we even probably went to Germany or to USA, change the sports, and we might get similar. But if we move those questions to places like Sub-Saharan Africa, or to developing Asia, most of those people, if you ask them that sort of question, they would probably be fortunate if they even had a television to talk, to actually watch. So I guess that's what I wanted to think about here, is this whole issue. And if we take the 2015 World Energy Outlook, it estimated, as many of you know, 1.2 billion people 17% of our global population did not have access to electricity in 2013. And many more have very poor supply. And my dear friend here, Chris Gregg from the UQ Energy Initiative, just recently sort of put this in perspective. When we're talking about energy access, this is the most basic level, and his example was 2 lights and some mobile phone charging. So we can think about the football, but imagine thinking about you're actually privileged if you have access to 2 lights and some mobile phone charging. Not to mention the millions of people, I suppose 2.7 billion, that are still relying on traditional solid biomass for cooking and all of the associated health impacts. So I think one of the things that all of you know, energy is central to so much in our world today. Whether it's jobs, education, security, there's so much about energy that's important. And I guess from my perspective, having watched this debate as a social scientist, when we think about fossil energy, which is deemed relatively affordable compared to the price of other energy technologies at the moment, to actually contemplate a world where demand for coal, oil and gas isn't there, I actually think it's quite tricky. And why this issue, I think, is so contested, particularly if we bring it back to Australia. Not only does it underpin a huge component of our energy right now, but it's also one of our largest export dollars earners. And you can only think about how we benefit from those. But I don't want to sort of say, it's not to say that things aren't changing. And we know there's a whole lot of technologies, be it battery storage, electric vehicles, the rise of the internet and smart appliances. Things are changing. But I think the question here is to think about, what is the way forward and how can we do that? And let's not forget those people without access. So I guess the other thing that really is of most concern to me, in addition to this issue of energy access, and it's actually why I got involved in energy in the first place, to me one of the issues is the lack of leadership, both here in Australia but also internationally, if we really want to get these Paris targets. I don't really see it. The need here for bipartisan, tripartisan support. Ideally, energy should not be a political issue except through leadership in making a difference. And actually, if we pause and think, China's actually probably one where we are seeing leadership. They've exceeded their 2020 targets for wind and for nuclear, far exceeded it in 2016. So one of the things that I think we will need is a meaningful price on carbon, and I won't go into detail about that, but I actually think that that will give an imprimatur to the fossil fuels to start changing some of their things and moving down the path that some of have started to be. And from my point of view, to be successful, one of the critical things with that, if we do, is communication. How do we make sure the public understand? Because quite frankly, energy affordability is critical for Australia, but it's also critical across the world. We had a webinar last night from somebody in Germany talking about the energy transition, and one of his biggest issues right now for that country is that prices are going up and the political party's concerned whether they're going to get voted back in. So again, politics is there. And that's my time.
And some. Mick? I'm sorry. That was below the belt. It's Mick.
Yeah, thanks, Karen, and thank you for the opportunity to come along and talk tonight and the invitation to be here. So I'd like to cover off on 4 areas fairly quickly, talk about the global outlook, global macroeconomic factors, talk about the role of coal and gas, talk a little bit about INDCs and COP21, and then finish off on low carbon solutions for both coal and gas. So let's talk about some of the global macroeconomic drivers that are going to affect us over the next 25 years out to 2040. So the first thing is population. The global population is going to grow by about 2 billion, from around 7.3 billion to 9.12 billion in 2040. The next thing is in terms of economic growth, and a lot of the information I'm using is also from the IEA. So let's talk about economic growth. It's projected to be around 3.4%, 3.5% out to 2040, but it's skewed very heavily to the non-OECD world. So OECD countries like Australia, Japan, UK, US, are going to grow around about 1.9%. So that's slower growth. But if you look at Asia, we're talking about 5.5% growth. Let's talk about urbanisation. Well, before I go to that, I'll come back to a point that Peter touched on. So 1.7 billion people in the world don't have access to electricity, but there's 2.8 billion people that don't cook with electricity or gas. And I wonder how many people in this room, I doubt whether it be anyone, but think about that, 2 out of 5 people in the world still cook without electricity or gas. 800 million in India alone, and in a lot of other countries in Asia. So there's a lack, they have this lack of access to the type of world that we have. And if we talk about urbanisation in OECD countries, including Australia, Japan, the countries I mentioned before, urbanisation is around 80%. So think about Queensland. You've got Brisbane, the Gold Coast, Rockhampton, Mackay, Cairns, Toowoomba. In the Asian world, the average is 47%. But if you go to a country like India or Myanmar or Vietnam, it's 33% of people, which means 2/3 live in rural areas. And most of those people who live in rural areas have the cooking facilities I described. So for economic growth and a better quality of life, we're going to need reliable, safe and affordable energy sources, not just for electricity, but essential services and industry and that development. So let's talk about what both coal and gas are used for. Well, most people would understand that they're used to make electricity. So today in the world, 41% of the world's electricity comes from coal-fired generation, and 22% from gas, 16% from hydro, 11% from nuclear, and non-hydro renewables today are 4% of the world's electricity generation. But coal has other important purposes. So 70% of the world's steel is made using coal. It's been that way for 2,000 years. And the other important ingredient that it makes a large contribution to, in fact 90%, is cement. So when you think about urbanisation and in developing Asia, they need those for the necessary infrastructure to do with roads, railway lines, buildings, schools, hospitals, airports. Let's just talk quickly about gas and even thinking about your own home. I would suggest to you the only thing in your own home that's not made with the use of coal or gas is the organic products such as wood or wool carpet. Everything else is probably mined, and it's either used some form of heat source to make that product. Glass, the heat product there is gas. Gyprock, gas. Think of all your tiles. Same bricks, you need gas. So, and of course we need it for cooking and heating as well as what we need electricity. So just to reinforce that, we mentioned the Rugby League Grand Final last Sunday. And I would like to ask how many of you understand how much of your electricity at that time was coming from coal and gas. Would you be surprised if I told you it was 98%? And anyone who wants those figures, I can give them to you. It was 89% coal-fired generation, and the other 9% came from gas. Now, that's in Australia. Typically, we're using about, particularly the eastern seaboard, quite commonly 85% of our electricity is coming from coal-fired generation. So it's going to be a big step as we change the energy mix. So think about Asia. India is going to grow its electricity generation by 3.5 times between now and 2040. Coal will be an important part of that. It's going to increase 2.5 times. But renewables are projected to increase at least 10 times. The International Energy Agency says that in Southeast Asia, again, coal will be 50% of the generation mix in Southeast Asia by 2040. Let's talk about energy as a whole, and I'll move on to the IEA very quickly. But in terms of energy in the world today, and every time you hop in a car or fly on a plane, you use oil. But today, oil, gas and coal make up 81% of the world's energy, primary energy. Even with the INDCs and the COP21, that's projected to fall to 75%. But to do that, we'll have to spend $13.2 trillion to achieve those goals. Now, if we want to drop down further, we're going to have to spend an enormous amount more. In actual fact, to do it, the IEA is saying you need a carbon price of $100 a tonne in 2030 and $140 in OECD countries by 2040. And even after that, those three sources of energy will drop down to 60%. So it's not easy, and I think some of the happenings in South Australia last week illustrate that. But the really important message I want to leave you with is there are low carbon solutions for oil, for oil there is, but particularly coal and gas. And that, for coal and gas-fired power station, yes, gas does give off CO2, about half as much as coal. Probably more if you take into account fugitive emissions. But the opportunity is with high efficiency, low emission power stations, you can reduce the CO2 emissions by 35%. If you go to carbon capture and storage, you can reduce them by 90%. Yes, that will cost, but all forms of energy will cost. So we are going to need, to conclude, we are going to need a balance between economic drivers, social needs, and meeting our climate change and environmental goals. So I'll leave it at that for the moment.
Thank you, Mick. Take us home, David.
All right, I'll try and keep this reasonably brief, and despite being nicely set up by Sandra to talk about policy, I'm going to actually talk about what COP21 actually means for the demand for coal and gas. And if we leave aside the INDCs and the commitments that were made until 2030, we've got to remember that the overarching ambition of COP21 was that we would limit the emissions in our atmosphere, to limit warming to well below 2 degrees from pre-industrial levels, and with a very strong aspiration of 1.5 degrees. What does 2 degrees below international levels mean for coal and gas? Well, for coal, you see coal demand peaking sometime later this decade and then start falling off by about 33% to 2040. And even in 2040, coal only exists because it has CCS. For gas, you see it peaking in the mid-2025s and then flatlining. And even then, it's still all around having some CCS to be able to do that. Now, if we take that 2 degrees, let's just look at what the 2 degrees means for people. Now, a general rule of thumb means that for developed countries like Australia, you have to get to net zero emissions by about 2050. For developing countries, that's sometime later this century. So that means we cannot produce, we have to have net zero emissions in 2050. This means the way that we currently burn coal, currently burn gas, cannot be done if you are going to meet your international climate change objectives. I'll put that in there. If you're going to meet those objectives, I understand the challenges that have been made by Peter in terms of access, the challenges that have been raised as well in terms of the fact that we are highly reliant on coal at the moment, and those issues around steel and cement are really tricky. And the steel and cement issues are one where we're probably going to end up having to look for offsets because we don't know how to do it differently. But the bottom line is that coal and gas have a limited future in a world where you actually are aiming to limit the warming of the planet to within 2 degrees of pre-industrial levels without CCS. And so, because I'm going to keep this short, I'm just going to quickly talk about CCS. Currently, CCS is a fairly expensive technology that is being used. If you compare it across the range, CCS with coal is not even close to being there. CCS with gas, you might get away with. CCS with gas looks okay. It looks comparable with some other technologies, but even then, onshore wind, even nuclear, look like they are going to be better bets than CCS. Let me give you an example. The IEA projections, they actually did the projections of what a 2-degree world would look like, and it calculated that by 2050, CCS would have to contribute to 60,000 million tonnes of abatement a year. Last year, the combined CCS projects in the world delivered 28 million tonnes of abatement. That gives you some idea of where CCS is going. And by the way, as a country that exports a lot of coal and gas, you'd think that Australia would be really keen on CCS. Back in the 2014 budget, the funding for CCS was absolutely slashed post-2017. We are not putting the money into it. The R&D is not there, and at the moment it doesn't look like cost effective. And unless CCS comes on board, there is very limited future for coal and gas going into the long term. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, David. I'm going to throw to you momentarily for your lively and engaging questions, so be ready. But I might kick off first with a question for Sandra. I've read your report to the extent that one can when it was released yesterday. First of all, congratulations on a report that actually takes an analysis across the whole supply chain to identify where climate risks are and who's really, really vulnerable. I was interested in the fact that the push for that is coming from investors, but I wonder what the level of awareness is from those that are high risk. In fact, you call it an existential risk for those that have a high level of exposure in a climate-constrained world. To what extent do you think there's a level of awareness that the end is near if we're to meet our Paris commitment?
I think some of the sectors are very well engaged in this. So I used to be the utilities and oil and gas analyst before I took on environment, social governance. So it's kind of my background. I can tell you some of Australia's utilities are really, they've worked out that they need to engage actively on policy. So you look for what's their disclosure like. So we have to actually, we hand out bouquets and brickbats. We gave a bouquet to AGL for, at least in their sustainability report released a couple of months ago, actually doing a proper 2-degree scenario and showing that loss of 25% of value of their generation assets. So you will find some companies doing it so well. They are actively engaged now under a new CEO with the government in how do we have an orderly closure of coal plants, particularly because they own the biggest, one of the most polluting brown coal plants in Victoria. So they're very actively engaged, and they originally came from a position of, our plant's the youngest, so everyone else will have to close before us, and we'll get all the upside. They've realised that's not politically palatable, and so they're looking for great solutions. So I have great hope for the utility sector. Some other sectors I feel are still in denial and are not seeing the risks and perhaps are not prepared for them. I still am staggered, and we wrote a paper earlier this year on stranded gas assets, and I understand we're the first to look at the stranding of deep water offshore gas, and it astounds me that companies will still pay big money to buy something off WA, 600 kilometres offshore, in the expectation that perhaps in 10 or 20 years' time they might be able to get up an LNG project. And they're still paying big money. So that's where I see big investor risk.
Mm-hmm. So, Mick, I might pick up on that with you in terms of the picture you painted was of a world that faces enormous challenges in the coming decades. And if I understood you correctly, that there's still, in your mind, a very, very, very strong role for coal and gas, but certainly still coal, which contrasts quite starkly with David's presentation. I wonder how do you anticipate us meeting our Paris Agreement, what kind of policies would you like to see in Australia that would see us avoid the worst of climate change and, at the very least, stay below 2 degrees, if not maintain at 1.5?
So if I give you a good example, and I gave you the high percentages in Australia, particularly the eastern seaboard, the percentages are high in Western Australia because they use both coal and gas, and quite often they're over 90%. So the technologies that I mentioned to you apply here in Australia as well. So if we take ultra-supercritical power plants that Japan and China have been building, which not only reduce CO2 emissions by 35%, SOx, NOx and particulate matters by 2/3. We don't have one ultra-supercritical power plant in Australia. We only have 4 supercritical power plants, which are not quite as effective, and the rest are subcritical. So the challenge for Australia is, I think, in balancing both the cost and the climate change goals for our energy supply and our electricity going forward. I mean, people would have seen the situation in South Australia, and of course the interconnector dropped out, and where does it get its power from? Mostly the brown coal generated electricity. So here's a dilemma. So to me, firstly, you have to have a stable and reliable and affordable grid. People in Australia need to be able to afford to pay for their electricity. There are solutions for coal and gas, and those solutions include those technologies here. But once you start going to very high levels of renewables, you have unstable grids, so you're going to need a secure backup. And that secure backup in Australia has to come from coal, gas, hydro or nuclear. And you are going to need, now if I take Japan, and their INDC is a good example, Japan in 2030 electricity mix will be made up of 25% gas, 25% coal, 25% nuclear and 25% renewables. 50% is non-carbon. That's how they're addressing it. I'm not advocating that that's the exact answer for Australia, but this has to be looked at very closely because, as the Prime Minister said last week, energy security is very important.
Do you want to respond to that, David?
I guess the first thing in terms of building even supercritical coal generation, we're kind of starting to reach a tipping point in terms of investment in generation if you believe in the fact that the 2 degree scenario is going to be met. So if I was going to build a new power plant now, if I was going to build a new coal one, the maximum life I can get out of that power plant without CCS is going to be something in the realms of 30 years. And given the expense, can we expect prices to be at the stage, particularly if we get any form of carbon pricing on that? I kind of see it as a little bit unlikely. I see gas playing a role in electricity generation going forward because one of the things about having high penetration of renewables, particularly intermittent generation, is you need flexible generation to be able to respond. That is gas, that's not coal. And so gas could very well play a role in the short term, but again, the same thing holds. You either want us to hit the 2 degree target or you accept that we're not going to. So if you want to hit the 2 degree target, any investment you make in these plants, you've got to understand that investment ends in 2050. And if we actually keep going on the trajectory we're currently at, that 2030 target, you don't actually hit 2 degrees. You hit somewhere closer to about 3 degrees. And those targets are going to change in 5 years. And that target for Japan is going to change in 5 years because everyone's got to come back to the table and resubmit it. You know, this is not saying that coal will not play a part or gas will not play a part. This is the reality of climate change. This is what you've got to do to be able to hit it. Now, you either choose to hit it, and in which case we have to start planning for a future where we don't have coal and gas, or we choose not to hit it, in which case we decide that you know, yes, we want energy security and affordability and all those other things as well, but if you start prioritising that over climate change, you accept that you're not going to hit the 2-degree target and you accept the risks that come with that. And that's the choice that is faced. And I guess I've not got much to add to that.
Can I just ask, do you think people are making that choice in what you're seeing today in, say, we could also, I'm interested in that because that's what worries me.
I don't think we'll hit 2 degrees. My personal view is that we are still going too slow now. I think that your point that you made at the beginning of this conversation about how long this has been around, in 1990, when they first came up with the 2 degrees, climate scientists thought it was a very conservative estimate because surely the world would act by now to actually be able to hit that. And now we're in real danger of not hitting 2 degrees. Basically, if we just stick to those INDCs that we've got going to 2030, basically the world falls off a cliff sometime in the mid-2030s. You basically have to stop polluting at that point. You know, you are going to have to do an awful lot very quickly, and there's just not the action there to be able to do it.
Sandra?
Yes, David. In April, I chaired a session on this particular issue in Hong Kong. And I had, one of the speakers was the Environment Minister for Hong Kong. And so I asked her about, you know, what is it with coal and China and when are they going to, you know, are they going to continue to build these ultra supercritical coal plants or supercritical coal plants? And the response was, China will continue to build these, and at some point they will then just decide that they're not going to build them. And suddenly, and we had through this conference used the term zombie state organisations. So suddenly there will be a massive pile of stranded assets, but China doesn't care. They will just turn the switch. We don't work like that in Australia. To get a ultra supercritical coal plant up, you need stability of policy and investment. And 30 years, yes, David, it doesn't cut it. You cannot make an economic case to build ultra supercritical for 30 years. AGL is closing plant after 63 years. That's kind of the investment case. And if you bring that NPV back to 30 years, it doesn't stack up.
Can I respond to that? China is leading the world in ultra supercritical power plants. Australia does not have one. So I don't know how you can say, criticise China. If you look at the INDCs was submitted into COP21, 19 countries submitted coal as part of their INDC. China committed to reducing the emissions from its power plants, coal-fired power plants. It committed to also reducing or curtailing or capping coal. But I was there in May, and it's extraordinary the commitment they have in their 5-year plan, which is in their INDC, to both knock down old coal-fired power plants and rebuild them with these ultra-modern ones that put out less emissions than any standard in Europe or the US or Australia. So, you know, there is a solution. It costs. Getting to 2 degrees costs, and people must realise that. But, you know, if you look at Australia, we produce 6% of the world's coal. We are the largest exporter of coal, about 32% of the world's coal, but we only produce 6% of the world's coal. But we can play a valuable role in finding solutions. And unfortunately, our agenda has dropped off on things like carbon capture and storage, but the world really needs to have a look at that. Don't forget carbon capture and storage. In the last 10 years, $2 trillion has been spent on other technologies, including renewables, 1% of that on carbon capture and storage. We can get to 2 degrees. We need technological solutions, but it will cost. Everything costs. The answer is in technology. And don't forget, CCS captures 90% of that CO2. But it also provides an opportunity for net negative emissions if you combine that with using biomass at the same time.
On that note, I might throw it out to you, dear closed public. We have questions galore. Okay, let's start at the back. Person with the lovely red scarf. If you could introduce who you are as well, please.
My name's Ellen. I've been campaigning on climate change for some years now. My question's for Mick. You're peddling a product that's threatening the biosphere. How do you sleep at night?
Look, I have no trouble sleeping at night. I'm an engineer, I'm a practical person, and I look towards solutions. So let's talk about some realities. What does coal provide? It provides necessary electricity, necessary steel, necessary cement to people, to here in Australia where we enjoy a very high standard of living. You know, you can't do without those products. Electricity is vital to lift. Can you let me talk, please?
Thank you, if we could keep it.
Well,
No,
and
no,
that's
no, no. Give the man a hearing.
that's the problem we have. It is quite polarised, but people are not rational in this debate about the needs of the world for energy. You cannot lift people out of poverty. All those people in Asia, in Myanmar, the greatest source of heating and warmth and that is actually wood. India, it's wood and cow dung. So 800 million people don't have it. We enjoy that. You know, here we are sitting in Australia, and you know, we're using very high percentages of coal and gas-fired generation. I do believe we'll reduce that. And there is a way of reducing it, but there comes a point in time where if you don't have a stable, reliable supply, you're going to have problems with your energy supplies we saw in South Australia last week. So you've got to get balances, and you've got to get balances between economic, social, and environmental aspirations. Sustainable Development Goals of the UN. The first one is no poverty. 7 is affordable electricity, affordable and clean electricity. And number 8 is having decent jobs and economic growth.
Thank you. Question from the gentleman in the front.
Trevor Baker from the St Baker Energy Innovation Trust, a major investment in energy efficiency and renewable energy, and separately I own a coal-fired power station. And thirdly, I created a gas-fired power station in ERM Power that is the 4th largest retailer in the country. And the comment I'd make is that here in Queensland, at the start of the real debate on climate change in the early 2000s, the Labor government under Beattie brought in a compulsory gas energy scheme to try to get Queensland down from 99% coal-fired generation. And within 5 years, he reduced the total footprint of electricity generation in a hugely growing Queensland market by 10%. And New South Wales did much the same with a slightly different scheme. But during that time, the issue of the industry doing something about it has been overtaken by schoolyard debates about utopia, which we just heard from the Grattan Institute isn't going to happen because, one, China's not going to be involved anyway, neither is India. So it's a great aim to get there, but all of the effort that people in the industry, like Mick he's there every day trying to find solutions. We had solutions at that time, and we were doing it. And what happened as a result of all the utopia and a Prime Minister being elected to solve the greatest problem of the world, which wasn't how we get there, but it was a solution which has turned out to be what's happened in South Australia. He brought in a carbon tax.
Sir, is there a question in there?
He brought in a carbon tax,
Okay.
which reduced gas-fired generation and increased electricity prices and that. So it's not a matter of someone having a go at Mick and saying he's answered the question, he's a pig. He's there contributing to the debate, and it's how we get there. It's not whether or not we have to be somewhere by 2050. It's how we do it today and tomorrow to keep the lights on as well.
Indeed, we have a question down the front here. And if I could just remind everyone to keep it short, snappy, and with a question mark at the end.
Sorry, Credit Suisse. This is going to be a bit random coming from a banker, but Peter and Mick, to the human commentary that you make, the argument we often hear is that development depends on power and power for development depends on coal. I sort of feel that we're having this conversation in absence of any understanding that the people most impacted by climate change, if it happens, will also be the poorest. I would love to hear from you on that front. Back on this question of, are we actually going to do 2 degrees or are we not? Are we thinking about these people's energy access in absence of the impact of climate change?
I don't think so. I think that's part of the issue. And I really don't know what the solution is. Just last week we had someone over from Indonesia, and they've got 17,000 islands to try and provide energy to. There's lots of innovations going forward, but at the same time, we need to find the most affordable ways to get them access, and that's what I'm constantly challenged by as to how we do it, because I don't see that. There is innovation and there are things trying, but even the small access lights, they are very expensive programs. And as you say, people are living in poverty. How do we lift them out? And that's the biggest conundrum, is I don't know what the answer is. We are transitioning away. I don't think we're transitioning fast enough. But I think as part of that, we need to make sure that those people are exposed to the same rights of development that we have in the developed world. And that, to me, is the challenge. I don't know what the answer is. And I'm concerned about climate change. I mean, one of the things I've said for many years is climate refugees. We're not prepared for that, and I think Syria is a fantastic example. These are the things that keep me awake at night when I think about this, and why I'm so keen to try and get these discussions happening. We've got to move outside the converted energy experts to people in the lay public, to the broader world. So it's very complex and very challenging. And we need the advocates for climate change to start communicating as well. But it's not an easy answer.
Hi, I'm Paul. I just wanted to raise an issue for your discussion around the fact that we're talking about developing countries often here these places were subject to colonisation, where a bunch of Europeans with business interests and some ideological agendas showed up and said, "Oh, we know what you need. You need civilization. You need Western kind of guidance for proper development." And that happened several hundred years ago, and many, millions of people lost their lives through the colonisation process. And now today we have people standing up saying, "Oh, all you people in those poor countries, we know what you need. I work for a mining company. I think you need coal." Totally ignoring the fact that we've got people like multiple Nobel Prize winners in the African continent saying that climate change is an extreme threat to people in sub-Saharan Africa. You had Nelson Mandela, Wangari Maathai, J.M. Katsir. The president of Uganda, Yoweri Museveni, said climate change is an act of aggression by the developed world against the developing nations. Now, I would really like to request that you have the respect not to speak on behalf of those people who are worst impacted by climate change in selling your products and marketing on behalf of the companies you work for. Please have that respect.
I didn't want to comment on that. In the meantime, the microphone is needed down at the 1, 2, 3. Just down here.
I'll just quickly
Please
respond to that. It's actually the governments in those countries that are making the decisions.
Thank you. You've had your time.
So India, Prime Minister Modi said he's going to give his people access to electricity 24/7 by 2022. The reality is one company in India produces more coal than Australia in total. And the government there, it's essentially government owned, is going to go from 500 or 600 million tonne to 1 billion tonne. And still then, all their people probably won't have that access. But at the same time, he's committed to large amounts of renewables. I mean, the rate of increase in renewables there is going to be many times what it is for our traditional coal-fired generation or gas-fired generation. The other example is Indonesia, a very large country. I mean, it's bringing on 35 gigawatt of electricity generation. 2/3 that is coal because they're endowed with that. But they're also bringing on renewables. But it's just so difficult. They're decisions that they're making as governments, as countries, not anyone externally forcing that upon them.
Next question.
Hi, I'm Marty Gallender. I spent about 30 years in the Queensland government doing energy type stuff. And one question I've been wondering about for years, and maybe you could shed some light. Australia's a major exporter of coal. It's not the largest producer, but it's, I believe, the largest exporter of coal, and Queensland is the largest state exporter. We also produce enormous amounts of aluminium. So my question is, who is ultimately legally and morally responsible for the emissions associated? Is it the country and the company that exports the coal and aluminium and other energy-intensive products, or is it the end user that ultimately carries the moral and legal responsibility for the emissions associated with that?
That's a good question. Who'd like to take it? Or did you have someone in mind? David, you've been nominated.
Oh, okay. Excellent. The one that I was after. I'm not aware that there's any legal responsibility for anyone in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, as far as I'm aware. I don't know any different. In terms of moral, this is a pretty good question. I think morally we need to sit back and actually think about why have we done this stuff? Why have we emitted over the lifetime? I think some of the points that Mick has raised has been good. Coal has been really good for us. It pushed us from the 17th century into the 20th century. It was responsible for a large amount of economic development that we had. We have really benefited as a society from this. Bottom line is we have to stop using it, right? But we have all benefited from this. When we buy our clothes, we have benefited from this. When we purchase anything, we benefit from the fact that these things have been emitted. So if we talk about, when people ask me, on a local level, what can I do about climate change? Well, at the moment, if you want to do something, stop consuming stuff. If you stop consuming stuff, you will reduce your carbon footprint. You will help emissions. I'm not advocating that that's what you should do, but on a personal level, that's what you can do. We have all been sat here consuming stuff that is emitted. We can sit there and blame the companies that have built it and try and sell it too much, but at the end of the day, they've done that because we've demanded it, because we have accepted it, because we've wanted the cheap products, because we've wanted those things. So to a certain extent, there is a moral responsibility sits on everyone because we're the ones that have done that. Okay, maybe we didn't know the extent to which those emissions were going to affect us, but we do know, okay? To an extent, those businesses didn't know back in the 18th century when they first discovered the Industrial Revolution.
So I think where Australia can help those developing countries and the developed world is there is it's inevitable that they will use some or a considerable component of coal and gas-fired generation. They'll use it for other reasons that I mentioned. The solution's around technology, and the developed world has the resources. We talked about carbon capture and storage. It's the developed world that can lead in that, not India or not Indonesia, and that's where we as Australia, as a large exporter, can play an important role. There are already bilateral and tripartite work going on, even between China and Australia, Australia and India. So that's a really, really important thing that we can do. I mean, I know people would like not to be able to use it, but in my view, to try and balance up those aspects I said, fossil fuels, and don't forget about oil for your own transport, for aviation, for shipping, will continue to be used, but we have to find solutions if we are going to get a climate change solution.
David, I know one of our major listed companies has done a 2-degree scenario for its business, and lo and behold, it finds that its business is entirely unaffected by a 2-degree scenario, despite having coal and petroleum in its business mix, because its 2-degree scenario, when you read the fine print, relies entirely on carbon capture and storage. Now, I know investors are particularly worried about that because it indicates to you a company that's perhaps in denial and is not looking at, as you would expect a board to, looking at a variety of options and realising that you can't put all your eggs in one basket of carbon capture and storage.
Gentleman at the back.
I suspect that what we're seeing here is a failure in policy. We've heard very eloquently from David Blowers that we have to reduce fossil fuel use in order to achieve 1.5 or 2 degrees. We've heard from Mick that this isn't going to happen because it's all terribly difficult and we're well established on that road. We've heard from Sandra that companies are now starting to think about this in a very proactive sense, and so the wheels of capitalism are now moving. The question is, what is the policy push which makes Australia do something that brings all of this together to actually get somewhere instead of continuing to talk about it, as we have for the last 15 years?
Great question. Did you want a response from anyone in particular? I suspect they'll all have a bite at that, but do you want to start, David?
I think we're still, in terms of the policy, I think that there's still a bit of a way to go. I mean, we released a report earlier this year that looked at how both political parties can take this forward in a bipartisan way, but it's not clear that bipartisanship actually exists yet. There is a pathway through it. There are potential schemes which could come about where we could end up getting that, but a lot will rest on the 2017 review that will happen next year, and a lot will be highly dependent on what happens on, firstly, both sides of the coalition party and also within Labor as well, and to more extent, whatever happens with the crossbenchers. But there are reasons to be kind of hopeful. I think the first thing is, as Sandra pointed out, businesses are now taking this seriously. Okay, that provides a significant push to government to actually find a deal if people are turning around and going, you have to come up with something sensible, and we want something sensible and we want it to stay. And finally, we're starting to get that message. I mean, just yesterday you saw a number of peak bodies come out and basically ask the government and the states to be consistent on their climate change policy. And it's really important that they do. So there's that, firstly, as a push. Secondly, the current political situation and the review, and the fact that there will be a review of the Paris targets in 2020 also pushes the government to do something. At the moment, its policies are not going to reach its 2030 targets. It's just not in place. It is going to have to put something else in place, and something else may well need Labor support if they're going to get it through Parliament. So the very nature of the Parliament at the moment makes it happen. The third factor is just international pressure. I know from speaking to people, generally Australia is not viewed very well internationally when it comes to talking about climate change. When they talk about it in closed doors, Australia is being treated a little bit as a pariah, basically because you had what we saw was a good system and then you got rid of it. And so that international pressure for Australia to actually go and do something will be another factor to actually get some decent policy in this space.
Not just climate change, sadly. Sandra?
Yeah, business is demanding that policy certainty and consistency. And we had a visiting professor out here recently, and it's nice to get the European perspective. When we informed him that one of our worst or largest carbon polluter in Australia was planning to close its brown coal power plant in 2048, he fell off his chair laughing. One possible solution to this politicisation of carbon is, because business does want certainty, is to come up with an independent regulator for this and take it out of the political sphere and give us that 10, 20, 30-year consistency. We regulate our financial institutions this way. We have an APRA. We need the APRA of climate change, and just take it away from politicians. We cannot afford to have 3 years of flip-flopping policy. that's just not sustainable. We're going to get nothing done and nothing built.
But in order to get that independent authority, you're going to need the politicians to agree to it, and they're presumably doing what the public wants them to do, or what they think the
also
public.
the public.
So, Peter, what's
and
the public's behind this ultimately, presumably.
Absolutely. The majority of Australians are concerned about climate change. If they could, they would have renewables tomorrow. But as we see, there's this issue of paying for it. So I think something like that is an important step, but we need to make sure we can bring the public along, I suppose, because from my research, looking at national surveys, you get this bell curve of people that are really proactive, this sort of early adopters, and they're doing great stuff. You've got all the people in the middle that are concerned, but they're busy. They're trying to feed their children. They're trying to get to work and just pay the bills. And, they don't have time to interact. So we've got to make it easy, but we've got to find a way to build people's literacy around this issue.
But Peter, to what extent are we seeing the public identify bushfires, floods, events like last week as being something that's going to happen more often and worse?
Well, I think what happens, and there's been lots of studies done of this, immediately after a severe weather impact, and we had it here in Queensland, people's concern goes up. But what happens, and I think it happens in our private lives as well about other issues, after the sort of a year or two goes on, you start to fall back into your lazy ways. I mean, the classic was when petrol prices went up, all of a sudden there were more small cars being bought, people were catching public transport, and Melbourne was losing money on their parking fees. But then roll on 3 years and suddenly that's become normalised and we all resume the behaviour. So
the same is true of drought. Until it rains.
Yeah, absolutely.
Look, we do need a very clear energy policy in Australia. I think we need that to have secure, affordable, reliable energy here in Australia. And, it doesn't matter whether you're a renewables company or whether you're a generator, and you can either be in gas or hydro or coal. You need clarity. Otherwise, one of the problems we will end up with is not having secure electricity and secure power. And to give you an example, in two things about the South Australian issue, there's been 3 big outages this year, is the price there just skyrocketed. I mean, went from $100 a megawatt hour to thousands.
That's been happening for years and years and years, David.
But
that's how the market was designed.
No, that's not to that extent. That is not right. And
that's true. In 2007-8, we had these repeated high price events in South Australia. Had nothing to do with renewables.
Higher spikes in 2013.
The other thing we had was that, I mean, we had a cyclone in Queensland, and with 200+ kilometre winds. And we didn't have the state fall over in its energy supply. But South Australia, they were less than 100 kilometres an hour. This is important. It's important for everyone to get that right.
Lady down the front's been waiting for a while.
Sure. You talk about the importance of continuity of supply, and that's clear. But you also talk about innovation and technology as perhaps being part of the solution. I wonder what your opinion is on these companies now that are producing storage batteries for solar based on zinc bromide and that sort of thing. Could this be part of the solution, the zinc bromide or any of the storage batteries that work with solar that will store the power when there's no sun and wind?
I think the answer to that is that there is no doubt at some point in time in the future, battery storage will be a very, very important part of the solution to grid stability. At the moment, the quote I've heard is that if you put all the batteries in the world together, you could run the world's supply for 9 seconds at the moment. But that's not to belittle the fact that I think the first thing you'll see battery storage coming into is particularly households, but to keep a major city going, that technology is not here, and it looks as though it's still decades away.
And so is carbon capture and storage.
No, actually, that's not correct. Carbon capture and storage is happening now. In Norway, they've been storing CO2 out under the North Sea from an LNG project for 20 years. It's the affordability of it, and if you want to bring the cost down, you've got to invest. So it is possible. There's a coal-fired power plant, Saskatchewan power plant in Canada that's running. There's about 20 in the world. It's not moving as fast as what it needs to if it's going to be part of the solution. And the reality is, if we want to get to 2 degrees or lower, it has to be part of the solution.
Now, friends and comrades, we are... Oh, you're looking very keen. I'm going to take 2 more questions. The young lady down the front, next generation, and then you with your hand up, because you're looking keen. But in the meantime, panellists, we'll then close with the one final thought you'd like to leave with our audience before we get back to 7:30. Young lady.
My name's Shani. My question is, in a context where we've got coal companies like Peabody, pure play coal companies going bankrupt, is the market going to take care of it before governments catch up? Basically, are we seeing money, are we seeing companies move in the right direction faster than governments because of the influence of, you know, associations like the Minerals Council, like the Queensland Resources Council, that are holding back our policy development at a federal and a state level?
Sandra, that's got you written all over it.
I can answer that one.
Mick.
So,
My mistake, sorry.
if we take Peabody, they are in Chapter 11, but they will come out of it. But I just saw something interesting in the US today. And right today in the US, I mean, gas is doing more generation than coal, but only just slightly more. So in the US at the moment, 30% of the generation's coming from gas, or 31%, 29 or 30% from coal. I think nuclear's next, and renewables are less than 10%. That's the US. Now, I think all coal companies do is respond to a need for supply. And, you know, I tried to make the case earlier that the oil, gas and coal are going to continue to be required for years to come for the necessary need of reliable and affordable energy. There will, you know, I mean, nuclear, we've seen UK commit to a nuclear power station.
Sorry, I've still got the mic. I'm going to jump in. That's not actually answering my question there. I was talking about whether we're seeing both companies and money flow away from dirty industries because traditional historic industries like the coal and gas industries have been holding back policy development. And I think the current energy mix doesn't really answer that question.
I think I'll jump in with an answer. Our concern is that as coal volumes fall away, and we're seeing India and China ramp up their own volumes, so we're looking at the Australian companies. If demand is falling by 10 or 20 or 30%, it's not rational in that it says, okay, demand has fallen 10%, we're going to shut down 1 in 10 mines. Everyone's volume is ramping down and their costs are staying high. And that's what's going to drive, you know, investor concerns that these companies will not be viable as demand starts to fall away. So that's where rationalisation of, you know, the capital markets will happen. It won't be, oh, let's just shut 1 in 10 and then 1 in 5 coal mines. Everyone's going to be affected across the board, and that's going to affect their cost base, revenue base, and they're going to become unviable, unprofitable, less profitable, and it's going to impact on their share price.
So to give you a slightly different view, volumes in Australia of coal have continued to go up. Volumes have not dropped off. From 2007 to now, 2016, coal volumes are up about 60%. Iron ore volumes are up more than double. The prices dropped, and like all commodities, prices dropped, particularly with slower growth out of China and the rest of the world. But volumes have not dropped off. The other important thing is coal in 2005 was the largest revenue earner for Australia, about 17 billion. Today it's 38 billion. Iron ore is 55 billion and gas is number 4 at around 17 billion. So they're making a major contribution to Australia's economy. And volumes are not dropping off. Sure, when prices come down, companies have to adjust. But that's the same for every cyclical downturn.
Very last question, pretty quickly, please.
Alan from BCC. In regards to energy security, wasn't it Vesey from AGL just yesterday or 2 days ago that said if your key driver is energy security, you should be looking at renewables rather than fossil fuels?
David?
Well, I haven't seen that. I have seen people before suggest that renewables will bring more in terms of energy security. Look, I think over the past 2-3 months with the situation in South Australia, I think people have become a little bit panicked about what's going on. I think people need to calm down a little bit in terms of what's happening. Yes, we saw very high prices, and as we've said before, those very high prices have been seen before. The issue there was actually about hedging and hedging contracts availability to businesses, and there's a question there about the availability of those hedging contracts and whether they're there for big businesses or not, and really that caused that outset. And what happened last week was, there was a big storm. It was a really big storm. And whilst the energy market operator hasn't been able to be definitive, I think everyone should wait until the 3 months is up and they can actually be definitive about the course of events and why these things happened. And the end result could be that it was just a very big storm. So in terms of energy security, there are lots of things that can be done. Yes, renewables can play a part in that. Yes, introducing different markets can be a part of that. Yes, making sure that your network is correct can be a part of that. But I think that the biggest thing that everyone needs to do is actually just take a step back and just think about what the real issues are here and to work through it methodically and make sure that we get the right electricity system for the future. Let's not jump to any conclusions.
Thank you. Now, in the interests of time, we're going to stop now, once we've had our nuggets of wisdom. If you're interested in carrying on the conversation, please do so on Twitter at the handle behind me, for those of you that know how to do it.
Will you be reading them?
Pardon?
Will you be reading them?
Will I be reading them? What?
The tweets.
No. Unless someone gives me a tutorial in it.
I can do that.
So, a 30-second nugget of wisdom from our esteemed panel, please, starting with Sandra, before we thank them riotously, whatever that word is.
So one other thing I look at is governance and how people react. And I get nervous when I meet with companies that are in denial or people who are in denial.
Thank you.
For me, I think the thing that I like to think of is it's a portfolio of options, and we've got to keep our minds open to what the end solution will be, and it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all. And, from the point of view, keeping aside vested interest and trying to be open-minded about what that portfolio might be, because we really need all our cards on the table right now in the way that the world is going, let alone Australia.
Yeah. Mick?
I'd invite anyone in the audience to go to the World Coal Association website. If you think we're in denial, go and have a look at that and have a look at the solutions that are there in relation to this issue around climate change. As I said earlier, it's not an easy fix. There's no silver bullet and there's no one-dimensional solutions, particularly when you've got the competing needs of providing affordable, reliable energy to the world. So that's both the economic aspect, it's both the social needs, and then combining that with finding a solution to environmental aspects, and climate change is just one of those environmental challenges. It's a very important one. It's in the minds of everyone, but you need a balanced solution.
Dave?
I'm going to change tack slightly. I did very quick maths in my head, and from Mick's numbers, coal and gas contribute $55 billion in revenue to Australia. That industry also supports an awful lot of jobs. And from what I said before, all of that's going to go by 2050. Now, if this was a business working properly, we'd have some sort of risk management strategy or transition plan in place. And at the moment, the governments across Australia do not have that in place. This is really important. That issue of denial is not there. Hazelwood looks like it might close. Hazelwood in Victoria looks like it might close next year. That's 1,000 people's jobs that are going to be affected. As much as we want climate change to happen and we want to move that transition, we have to understand that people will be affected and governments need to get on it and actually put transition plans in place.
And my little gold nugget is that as we do that, let's not lose sight of what a world that's warmer than 2 degrees looks like, because we don't want to go there. We really don't. All right, friends, colleagues, comrades, please join me in wild applause to thank our audience, our panel. And I say adieu.